Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all. Welcome to episode 33 of Fire Code Tech. Want to give a big thanks to our sponsor for this episode, Wachter, but we'll hear more from them later on in the show. On this episode, we have Stan Szpytek. Stan is the president of the Fire and Life Safety, Inc. Stan has been in the fire and life safety industry for over 35 years. Stan runs a consulting practice now in which his specialty lies in risk analysis and disaster preparedness for boarding care and skilled nursing facilities. I was compelled to have Stan on the podcast because I found him while watching a presentation online about Center for Medicare Facilities and common fire and life safety issues. I'd never had a person before on the podcast who had a specialty in disaster preparedness, so I really enjoyed getting a different perspective from Stan on this episode, and we talked about some topics that I had never discussed before on the pod. Don't forget to give us a follow on LinkedIn and subscribe so you never miss an episode. So, if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, that would be a huge help. Well, Stan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so happy to have you today. Welcome to Fire Code Tech.
It's great to be here, Gus.
Awesome. Stan, well, we were speaking a little bit before and having a lot of good conversation, but I'm excited to have you on. And, I always kind of like to get started with a little bit of your background and how you found your way into fire and life safety, if you wouldn't mind telling the listeners, Stan.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. And, with a last name like mine, through the years, I've been given a nickname. That nickname is Stan the Fireman. Nobody can say those 7 letters of my last name, Szpytek. If I ever get a chance to go on Wheel of Fortune, the first thing I think I'll say is, Pat, I'd like to buy a vowel. But I'm Stan the Fireman because I had a wise old nursing home administrator about 20 years ago when I started consulting while I was still active in the fire service as a deputy fire chief and a fire marshal in a suburban Chicago fire district. She looked at me and she looked at my business card and she said, I'll never be able to say that last name. She says, I officially dub you Stan the Fireman. And at first, it felt a little corny, but you know what? If people can remember you by a nickname or a moniker like Stan the Fireman, and if it's not a bad thing, I think it's probably a good thing. But I'm Stan the Fireman because I started in the fire service. Now, this is what's a little frightening to me. When I do the simple math, I've been involved with emergency response, fire safety, education, consulting for 44 years. I started in the fire service in 1977 as a cadet on a fire district in the Chicago metropolitan area that had a fire department that was volunteer, paid on call, kind of a combination department, like many of the departments in the metro area. Through the years to present date, most of those fire departments are now either full career or combination departments, fully staffed. But I think about the origins and my desire to get involved with the fire service. We all know about the influence that role models have on us. Now, my role model when I was a little kid wasn't an athlete, wasn't a movie star or a person on a TV show. I remember being in first grade in Burbank, Illinois. I remember the fire department coming to my school during fire prevention week. I still remember that firefighter putting me up on the side of that old, I think it was a 1956 Mack pumper, and putting that scary air mask up to my face. And I just remember what my response was. I'm like, I want to be one of them. And at 16 years old, I was able to kind of realize that dream because the community that I lived in had a cadet program. You needed to be 15 and a half, actually, when I knocked on the door of the fire station in Palos Park, Illinois. And the next thing I know, I'm on a vocational path that led me to a career that gave me a wonderful experience in the fire service that ultimately allowed me to retire from the fire service at a relatively young age. I did my 26 years. Part of those years were as a cadet, and then as a volunteer, then as a paid on call. And then I was one of the community's first 6 full-time firefighter paramedics that were hired in 1983. And in a blink of an eye, a 20-year career on the fire department kind of came and went. And at the ripe old age of 42, in 2003, I retired from the fire department and I did what all good Chicago area firefighters do. I moved to Mesa, Arizona. So I really didn't retire at all, guys. What I did was kind of shift gears, and I started to follow a passion that I have, and that was to be a fire and life safety consultant.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that bit of exposition on your background, Stan, and kind of the first formative years of your career and your background in the fire
Mhm.
service. That's very interesting. I wanted to transition to, speaking broadly about your career. You talked about a couple of the roles that you've held so far, but I also wanted to, dig a little bit deeper into more specifically how many, the kind of hats that you've worn during your
Mhm.
time in the fire service and kind of segue into
Sure. Well,
what you're
that's a
doing
good
now.
question because that's what I often promote and project to people when I'm explaining my background is that being on a smaller suburban fire district or fire department, a fire district is a separate taxing body similar to a school district. And in that district, there was a couple of different municipal and county jurisdictions. But the hats that I wore, started from being a fire cadet to becoming an EMT to becoming a paid on call firefighter. But in my official professional capacity as an employee of the district when I was first hired in 1983, I was a paramedic, I was an engineer, and in the fire service, an engineer is a person that operates the apparatus, drives the fire equipment, operates the pump. So, not to the level of engineer as you and many of your peers are, but a fire service engineer, meaning the chauffeur or the operator of the equipment. I was also a certified fire investigator, a certified paramedic. I was the shift commander on my shift. I moved up through the ranks from lieutenant to captain to fire marshal to deputy chief and fire marshal. So not only was I responsible for the response components of the fire department and administrative functions, but I was also a bureau chief, meaning that I was in charge of the Fire Prevention Bureau. So, with the hats that I wore in the Fire Prevention Bureau, I did plan review, I did public education, I did building inspection. Um, when major incidents were kind of bubbling to the surface, and this is even before 9/11. But think about what it was like in emergency response or the safety sectors or emergency preparedness prior to the year 2000. A lot of people remember the anxiety and apprehension that we had as a world when it comes to or when it came to Y2K, which was a non-event that never occurred. But then there was a need in communities to have someone that would deal with the emergency preparedness or emergency management elements of operations. So suffice to say, Gus, I wore a lot of hats, and it was really kind of the launching pad for me to get involved with consulting on my watch and in my jurisdiction, it was primarily a bedroom community, meaning that we didn't have any industrial areas. The jurisdiction was a mix of residential properties, kind of an affluent area, bigger houses, bigger lots. I had some houses in my jurisdiction that were built on my watch that were as big as 20,000 square feet for a single family private residence.
Wow.
But I had mostly, schools, I had some churches, but I had 3 nursing homes that were built on my watch, along with an assisted living facility, a senior retirement community, along with a memory care building and an assisted living facility. And all of these long term care type facilities that were within my jurisdiction that I was involved with, from concept to design to inspection to build out to signing the certificate of occupancy, to conducting inspections in those buildings, to responding to emergencies in those buildings. I remember one such emergency happened in the late 1980s at one of my nursing homes on College Drive. And I entitled the article that I wrote about a fire that happened in that facility, Nursing Home Fire, a Success Story. And in that article that was published in Fire Engineering magazine, I compared and contrast the elements of my fire to several serious fatal fires that occurred around the nation in skilled nursing facilities where dozens of people were killed, whereas in our fire, everything went right. Sprinkler system activation, fire alarm system activation, proper staff response, horizontal evacuation. It was a page 6 blurb in the local newspaper instead of being a front page or front cover of the Nfpa journal because dozens of people died. So maybe you're picking up on my proactive perspective on the fire service. I loved being a responder, couldn't wait to be one. But I started as a consultant to refocus my efforts and, probably more appropriately, my passion on the proactive side of fire and life safety, the of trying to prevent those events that we hope never make the newspaper.
I like that. I like that. There was a lot of great points there, Stan. I liked hearing about, you I feel like you started to touch on a little bit of your specialty in fire and life safety. I always like to get a sense of individuals and kind of where their experience has created a niche or a wealth of experience. And to me, it sounds like it was kind of the dipping the toe in the waters of the more residential facilities or like some of the
Yep.
institutional occupancies. But yeah, but I appreciate that. And, yeah, maybe for those who don't know you, you could speak more directly at the kind of consulting work that you're involved with now. And
When I moved to Arizona, I knew that my business model and my consulting business was going to focus on a couple of different silos. We do fire and life safety surveys and evaluations of all types of occupancies. We've got connections. My company, Fire and Life Safety Incorporated, or FLS, has relationships with many insurance companies where we do safety surveys of schools within school districts. We work with several different archdioceses around the country connected with different insurance groups and insurance pools. But my main element of consulting as the principal of the company is healthcare and senior services. And within that umbrella of specialty, I'm really focused on long-term care. I'm the life safety and disaster planning consultant for a few different state associations, including the Arizona Healthcare Association, the California Association of Health Facilities, and the Utah Healthcare Association. In addition to that, I've been able to really modify and maximize my niche with long-term care associations around the country. And I'd say I'd probably have been connected to at least half of the state's um, healthcare associations where I get engaged to do breakout sessions on emergency preparedness, life safety. One of my true areas of specialty are the CMS, which is Medicare, Medicaid, requirements for healthcare facilities, both on life safety and emergency preparedness. I design and conduct tabletop exercises. I facilitate discussion-based exercises. And I've had to do probably what you and others have done when it comes to the educational venues during a pandemic. I've done a lot of webinars on life safety, one in particular, life safety considerations, or life safety in consideration of COVID-19. You know, what were the life safety, or what are the life safety consequences of transforming buildings with strong focus on infection control and management? So even though I've worked with many different types of occupancies through my connections with insurance companies or standalone clients that we've been able to engage with, which includes general industry, public assembly, board and care, mercantile, I'd say my sweet spot is the work that I do with long-term care and healthcare facilities around the country.
That's great. I appreciate that a little bit of added information about, kind of the services you provide and some of the different types of work that you're involved in. I mean, I guess this next question may be obvious, but as somebody who, works as a consultant or somebody who gets into specialized work, I just have a fascination with, somebody like yourself to go out and start a business of your own. It appears to me that your specialty and your experience has kind of dictated, what kind of services that you've offered as a consultant. But I'd wondered if you haven't had any more exposition on like how you determined what services to offer as a consultant. I just think it's you kind of had a wide open space. You could have put your time into, you know, you had to have some passion behind these to get into them.
Yeah, there was definitely a genesis to this, and it already goes, I mean, it goes directly to the article that I spoke to you about. So there was an admissions director that was at the facility that had the fire, that I wrote about, the success story fire. And, one thing that I prided myself on in my jurisdiction was that I made a connection with these long-term care facilities, the occupants within the jurisdiction, whether it was the owner of a strip mall, the occupants at the strip mall, the operators of a nursing home, the community hospital that was in my jurisdiction, the churches, the schools. I was that fire marshal, that had a partnership with those types of agencies, so that when the fire came that day at 7:15 in the morning at that facility on College Drive, we weren't meeting each other for the first time. We had a relationship, and we managed the problem together. Well, it was this admissions director that was at this nursing facility who went on to become an executive director, so the leader of an assisted living facility in another nearby jurisdiction. She came to me and said, Stan, listen, all that great stuff that you did at my facility when I was the admissions director, the community that my new building is based in doesn't have those kinds of resources. And, can you come to my building and teach the people how to evacuate, how to use a fire extinguisher, how to shelter in place? And vis-a-vis, I had an entrepreneurial thought. She said, and I'll even pay you to come and do this for me. So I remember staying up into the wee hours of the morning at the fire station when I was on duty or when I was off duty at home, putting together a business plan, coming up with the business that was really focused on just doing fire safety kind of stuff. But through the years, just like my career in the fire service evolved. At first, going back to the 50s and 60s and 70s and all points before that, the fire service really was all about what? You get response, you put the wet stuff on the red stuff, and it was really all about putting out fires. But then in the 70s, we became more involved with, emergency medical services. We had EMTs, then we had paramedics. Then in the 80s, it was all about hazardous material response. Then it was technical rescue. Then it was being responders to weapons of mass destruction. You think about your firefighters today, it's all about an all hazards approach to emergency preparedness, response, recovery, and continuity of services. And I just took all those elements and kind of incorporated them into a business where, again, it started out on a fire safety focus, then it expanded to emergency preparedness, and today it's gone even beyond that. I've gone into risk management, loss control, infection measures. I've got a relationship with an industrial hygienist. You can only imagine the kind of work that we've been doing in the midst of a pandemic, but it's kind of been a dovetail of services that really, focus at the foundational level of life safety and preparedness, but there are so many elements of that. I think one client that I had characterized what I do for my clients in a very simple phrase. He said to me, "Do you know why I hire someone like you? Because I'm not an engineer, I'm not a PhD, I'm a technician, I'm a fire marshal that can work to the advantage of my clients and their operations." He said, "I hire guys like you, or I hire you specifically because I need you to be my conscience. I want to make sure that we're meeting code, that we're doing things to the level of best practices. And when it comes to long-term care or senior services like a retirement community, which I work with many of them around the country, coast to coast, the net product are the clients, the people, the customers that they serve. They're not producing a widget or a gadget. They're providing, and this is what I say in many of the presentations that I make to staff to educate, inspire, and motivate them. You're not just selling a beautiful environment of care or service. You're not providing simply a wonderful culinary experience and activities. The basic thing that you're providing is life safety and security. And that's what I kind of enhance my clients when I get involved with them.
I see. Yeah, I like that. It's a good point. I was offered this piece of advice, or somebody was. We had a salesperson come in to speak with us about. They were trying to sell their product, and they were saying, how they had trouble conveying, how they add to the bottom line because they are a something that's in fire and life safety, and I had issued a piece of advice that I had heard on one of the previous episodes of this podcast. It was, as fire and life safety professionals, we maintain the company's right to do business in the eyes of the law. So I love that point that you're talking about how you are providing a safe environment for people, and if the fire and life safety is paramount to that value proposition. I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor today, Walkter. Walkter is a family-owned business that provides services in many commercial and industrial market sectors, including electrical and fire alarm systems, the Internet of Things, digital transformation, and much, much more. Walkter is headquartered out of Lenexa, Kansas, but is decentralized in that they have technicians across the nation. They are looking for good candidates for fire alarm technicians in a variety of locations across the U.S. You can find out the details of these jobs and much more about Walkter on walkter.com/careers. That's WACHTER.com/careers. Let's get back to the show.
What's interesting, Gus, is that many of my clients don't have to hire me. They don't have to hire someone like this, but the clients that do, to me, they're the ones that get it. They are kind of hedging their bet by not only meeting minimal compliance, but they want to provide optimal safety for the people, that generally occupy their buildings. Now, when I talk about regulated healthcare, such as a nursing home that might receive funding from a funding agency like Medicare or Medicaid, they do have regulatory requirements. And I'm the person, and my team or my company comes in, and we kind of are the objective observers. We're the conscience of the facility. We let them know what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, where are their opportunities for improvement. So when that state or federal surveyor or local inspector comes in, they're not going to find the penetrations in a firewall. They're not going to see that the provider had missed the quarterly sprinkler test. We find these things, so we do a lot of mock survey, mock life safety tours, mock emergency preparedness tours to make sure that the providers are meeting their codes. And in many cases, they're exceeding them. And that's the kind of environment, and that's the kind of client we like to work with.
That's great. Yeah, it's always nice to see good maintenance records and to be involved with clients who are concerned with not just meeting the minimum requirements of code, which that's what they are, minimum requirements, but providing going above and beyond. But yeah, you touched on a couple times this CMS Center for Medicaid and Medicare and kind of the codes and standards around it. How I found you, Stan, was looking on YouTube. I was working for a hospital and I was trying to, navigate the codes and standards around CMS facilities. And I found a great presentation on YouTube that you were doing about some of these common fire and life safety features and speaking about the codes to some extent around these facilities. I'd love to hear you speak a little bit on the codes and standards structure around these kind of occupancies.
It's confusing because CMS obviously is a federal agency, and they needed to adopt consistent codes and standards that are applicable and enforceable around the country. CMS typically engages contractors to provide the enforcement leg of the regulatory requirements. And in many cases, the enforcement body or the contractor in an individual state is a state's Department of Health or similarly titled agency. In Arizona, it's the Arizona Department of Health Services. In Illinois, it's the Illinois Department of Health. In California, it's the California Department of Health, but there's a breakout in California where the County of Los Angeles is the CMS um, contractor. So state surveyors working as a representative of the federal government come in from a life safety and emergency preparedness perspective, and they make sure that these buildings are up to a specific code. Now, the addition of the code or the main code that they are focused on and are regulating is the Life Safety Code, NFPA 101. But presently, the addition of NFPA 101 is the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code. This is often in conflict with other jurisdictions that may not enforce the Life Safety Code or have a different, more commonly, a more current edition of the Life Safety Code. But getting down to the brass tacks of enforcement, CMS enforces the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code, the 2012 edition of NFPA 99, the Healthcare Facilities Code, and in Chapter 2 of the Life Safety Code, as most code officials and code aficionados know, Chapter 2 in NFPA 101 is the referenced publications, codes, and standards. So whatever Chapter 2 of the 2012 edition of the code references, those are the other applicable editions. I believe the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code references the 2010 or the 2011 edition of NFPA 13, the same for 72 for fire alarms. And a lot of folks will say, wait a second, it's 2021. Why are they using such an older edition of the code and codes and standards and publications? Well, it's the federal government, and they've got to come up with some standard. And in my experience, it's about every 5 to 7 years, they'll go through the process of Congress updating a more frequent, or I'm sorry, a newer edition of the code. But right now, we're in the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code, and I would imagine at some point in the coming years, we're going to see CMS adopt a newer edition of the Life Safety Code. And one of the things that leads to, Gus, is a lot of frustration. I can only imagine in your practice when you're trying to figure out the codes and standards for one of your clients, you've got to look for those conflicts, you've got to look for those incongruencies. And in my experience with healthcare facilities, particularly long-term care or skilled nursing facilities, there's a ton of frustration when it comes to navigating all the different AHJs that are out there.
Yeah, Stan, it's definitely a struggle. It feels like operating in a very specific or a different state, and like I'd compare it to like the difference between traditional code and then like working on a Department of Defense job. It's you got to throw the book out the window and assume a whole new rules of engagement and operations. One part that was confusing for me, and maybe you could touch on this a little bit, was the International Building Code is generally what's adopted in
Mhm.
most of the jurisdictions that I work in. How does NFPA 101 and how CMS and how they adopt NFPA 101 and NFPA 99, how do these two documents play with each other? Because the state or the one of the jurisdictions that's not the Medicare facility might adopt IBC or IMC, and so how do these two documents cohabitate, I guess?
Well, they really don't, because the CMS doesn't really dabble into building codes. They defer to the appropriate jurisdiction that has authority, and sometimes there's multiple jurisdictions. I go back to my experience working with the fire district. I had three different municipalities within my district, along with unincorporated Cook County. Each of those jurisdictions had their own building code, their own electric code, and then if you factored in a school, the school was exempt from our particular authority. They had their own code, and even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they were still using, I believe, the 1967 edition of the AIA code. So there's a lot of conflict, a lot of consternation, a lot of frustration. And that's when I would have to tap in my third party reviewer, my fire protection engineering company from a local fire protection engineer that was in the Chicago area to navigate some of these things. But CMS really does not address um, the building codes at all. They defer to the ones that are applicable. And then if any of our listeners are thinking about an assisted living facility, to the common person on the street, you're driving by a Manor Care facility, a Sunrise facility, a Genesis facility. The assumption can't be, if there's elderly folks in there, that must be a nursing home, because there's different levels of care and licensure that's out there that comes with different requirements. But just to compare and contrast, assisted living facilities are regulated by state regulations on board and care or assisted living. They are not regulated by CMS, nor do they receive CMS or funding from Medicare or Medicaid. It's all private pay, so it's extremely, I don't know if convoluted is the right word, but it's very confusing when it comes to peeling back, you know, the depth of the different authorities that have jurisdiction on these types of facilities.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of my confusion comes from too. Stan is working for a hospital with a myriad of different authority having jurisdictions, and stakeholders at hand, kind of makes the issue not so clear. So I appreciate that, some more insight on these kind of occupancies. I'm fascinated with any little, or it's not little by any means, but any different kind of pond or different place in fire and life safety where there is a lot of value to be added, and these occupancies obviously are one of those. But uh,
Well, let me tell you this: when it comes to healthcare facilities, anyone familiar with the Life Safety Code, and in particular the 2012 edition of the code. They know that chapters 18 for new construction and chapter 19 for existing, that's the main area that we're going to when it comes to life safety compliance in these facilities. But like I said, the focus is the means of egress. The focus is those life safety provisions. It doesn't really acknowledge a whole lot on building construction. Certainly, building construction and construction type minimally is required for these types of buildings. But then, if you factor in IBC or BOCA or AIA, there's going to be conflict, and that's usually where it becomes a pretty dicey proposition for many of these types of properties.
Yeah, definitely. I
The other
understand
thing
that.
too, the point that I wanted to make was when it comes particularly to the domain that I work with, skilled nursing facilities. I don't know if this is a badge of honor or if it's a cross to bear, but skilled nursing facilities are the most highly regulated type of occupancy in the country, only second to the nuclear power industry. Gus, you mentioned that you do work with hospitals. Even hospitals aren't regulated to the point that a nursing home is, and maybe rightfully so. But here's an example. When you design or review a system, you know that there are certain areas within a hospital. Maybe it's a closet in a patient room that's less than 12 square feet, may not require a sprinkler head. But in a nursing home, if you had a 1 by 1 square foot closet and it met the definition of a closet or a space, you're going to see a sprinkler head in there. These facilities are fully sprinklered, sometimes completely consistent with local jurisdictions that are proactive and up to speed with modern codes and standards. But there is no standard across the country when it comes to individual jurisdictions. But nursing homes are put through the ringer. In a hospital, you only have to test and evaluate your smoke and fire dampers every 6 years. In a nursing home, it's every 4 years. So it's things like that that help me kind of clarify the niche of health services that I wanted to focus on from a fire and life safety perspective. Whereas in a hospital, they might engage an engineering firm like yours to support their in-house fire and life safety folks. But when it comes to a nursing home, it's usually the maintenance director who is also responsible for turning rooms, painting rooms, taking temperatures, who's responsible for life safety and emergency preparedness as well. So I just saw an opportunity to be a third party supporter and provider for these kinds of facilities that just don't have those in-house resources.
I see. I see. That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you illustrating the differences between the two occupancies and their similarities and differences. But
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to move on to, you have a specialty in emergency preparedness and kind of planning for different events like this. And I've never had the opportunity to speak with anyone with an area of expertise in this field, if you will. And so I wanted to talk to you about, kind of what emergency preparedness is, and, maybe contrast that to the kind of traditional fire and life safety for buildings that I'm used to, or that you're, aware of, that's kind of more the fire protection engineer specialty.
Well, like I said earlier, it's kind of all dovetailed together. One of the things that I often stress when I'm presenting either on life safety or emergency preparedness is that compliance for compliance sake is something that a provider should never focus on. They should never just focus on checking the boxes and meeting minimal compliance. Subsequent to some major disasters that have happened in our country since 9/11, through Katrina, through major wildfires, and the impact those disasters have had on healthcare and particularly long term care, Um, CMS, again, along with many other states, have put a lot of focus on regulatory compliance for emergency preparedness. In California, a few years ago, they passed a bill that made assisted living, that required assisted living facilities to be better prepared for all the different disasters and emergencies that can happen in a state like California. But one of the reasons that life safety compliance and emergency preparedness has kind of aligned in my practice or my scope of practice is because when CMS comes in and regulates a facility and assesses their life safety, they issue K tags or deficiencies if something is out of compliance. But when in 2016, CMS adopted some very stringent emergency preparedness requirements for skilled nursing facilities, hospitals, and 17 different CMS provider type recipients that receive federal funding to operate healthcare facilities. And this includes inpatient hospice, dialysis centers, behavioral care facilities, and so forth. They put some very specific requirements and they developed what's known as e-tags that identify the different levels of preparedness that are required to be in these facilities. Typically, in most states, it's the life safety surveyors that now also look at the emergency preparedness elements of an operation. So it was kind of a natural pairing that my focus evolved from just life safety to emergency preparedness. And some of the main elements of emergency preparedness in healthcare facilities is the same as emergency preparedness from a community based perspective. Emergency preparedness needs to have an all hazards approach, meaning facilities need to know what the hazards and perils are so that they can appropriately prepare for those types of events to occur. Now, in my experience, emergency preparedness was very geocentric prior to these regulations, meaning if I was working with a facility in the Midwest, their emergency plan typically focused on the obvious fire, flood, power failure, but then a lot of focus on severe weather. When I'm working in the Bay Area or a seismically active area, the plan seems to be all about seismic activity. If it's a coastal region, it's tropical depression or hurricane. I know you'll feel sorry for me, Gus, but I've even had to go to Hawaii and do work with some of the nursing homes around Pearl Harbor in Pearl City. And their plan was all about tsunami and tidal surge. So the shift has been a focus on an all hazards approach. It's regardless of what the type of emergency occurring, facilities need to have a plan to deal or manage these types of emergencies with an all hazards approach, what typically equates to hazard vulnerability assessment and the implementation and integration of the incident command system into their operations.
Very interesting. Wow, I like that your take on that it has become more holistic in nature, emergency preparedness. I think that's a very cool insight on the field. It's not always very apparent to me how all that works. Though I've seen people who are employed as like that's their entire job function is emergency preparedness and facilitating this kind of these services where you're helping communities, or sometimes I'm sure that I've seen it for people who specialize for schools or college campuses. So I really think it's a big emerging field. I think fire and life safety and safety in general is kind of gaining steam all the time. So it's very interesting for me to hear you speak about this subsect of safety and more like I don't know. It's a safety in a more broad sense than just the building. I guess it's more of safety, maybe on a similar level, like you were saying. You've had experience with insurance companies and how they evaluate risk. They evaluate risk more holistically in earthquake, flood, and some of these other factors that you're talking about. But I'm not so involved usually on the nature perspective of safety, and maybe for some mass notification systems and having a button on the panel that says, hey, there's a weather event or a tornado or something, but that's about it.
Yeah. Well, you use the word holistic. What I like to say is we focus on a programmatic approach to fire, life safety, and emergency preparedness. It's not just all about the built environment, which is clearly one of your specialties. It's not about the hydraulics or the voltage. It's about the plan. It's about the training. It's about the drills, the exercises, the stuff, the supplies, the contingencies, the relationships that providers need to develop with their competitors, which might be the nursing home or the hospital down the street. And everybody under normal conditions is focused on putting heads in beds and competing with the other entities. But in a true emergency or disaster scenario, it's got to be an all in, all together programmatic approach. Just putting this into action. When I sit in my office doing reports and paperwork and research, in the background, I'll go on an app and I will listen to my department, my old department back in Illinois, running out on calls all day. Well, yesterday while I was in my office, I heard them dispatch to what came in as a smell of gas in the area. When units got on the scene, they discovered that they had a high pressure underground gas leak. The situation was caused by a cable crew that was trying to bury some TV cable. They punctured this high pressure gas line. And one of those nursing homes that I talked to you about earlier that were built on my watch was 100 yards downwind from this high pressure gas leak that was going to take up to 6 hours to remediate. The gas company says it's going to take us till about the call came in around 10 or 11 in the morning. They didn't think that they would have the situation rectified until about 5 or 6 that evening. I heard the response upgraded from just a simple single engine response for a gas leak to what we call a full, still, and box alarm, where multiple fire units and ambulances were dispatched to that nursing home to initiate relocation and potentially evacuation of the facility because that natural gas was, right there. So it never got to the point where they had to evacuate, but they had to relocate people from the closest area of the building, this multi-story nursing home, to the furthest area. Crews were on standby for several hours. But the point I'm trying to make is that that nursing home identified things like that as part of their emergency plan. And when the fire crews showed up, it wasn't a foreign operation to anyone. It was kind of business as usual. The incident commander within the care center likely worked seamlessly with the incident commander from the fire department, and they were able to deal with the operation in a proactive way where, maybe saying business as usual is a little bit of a stretch, but it was a well orchestrated operation where no one was hurt. The people of the facility were safeguarded. The operators of the facility knew about pipelines and hazmat trucks that drive right down the street. So it didn't come as a huge surprise that they had to go into the emergency operation mode.
I like that. That's interesting. I always enjoy it when people give real world accounts of, when these plans or, when pieces of their projects or operations are put into practice. I think it really drives home the meaning of what we do and, real world example. It all sounds kind of nebulous when you're speaking about, these lofty ideals of having being prepared and having everybody know their role, but when you explain it like people being able to protect their facility and and those who are part of the building, in a real world application. I think that always helps drive the message home of why we do what we do. So I like that.
Well, this is what I've always said. It's a normal day at your facility until it's not. And yesterday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, it was a normal day at that nursing home until they got a knock on the door from a local police officer saying, prepare to either evacuate or relocate because this incident had just occurred. The same is true with whatever the peril might be. The process of hazard vulnerability assessment is a specific process that all healthcare providers under CMS regulations are required to go through. There are some tools that are out there. One such tool that's commonly used was produced by Kaiser Permanente in California, and it's a simple spreadsheet that lists 85 different perils, from technological failure to mechanical failure to systems failure to fire to flood to active shooter to civil unrest. It even includes zombie apocalypse as the final peril
Mm.
that the facility as a team would rate what is the probability, what are our levels of preparedness, so we can determine what is our risk. And now these facilities are no longer arbitrarily speculating what could happen. They know that there is an underground gas line within a quarter mile of their facility. They understand that tornadoes could be a threat in a place like Oklahoma or Kansas or Illinois or just about anywhere in the country. But to what level? And that's what the HVA process does, is it scales, with an algorithm after you input the data. What is your probability of these things? And then what CMS says is that facilities, whether it's a hospital, a nursing home, a hospice, or when it comes to best practices, any kind of business, you need to focus on your high probability of threats and perils. So if you are in the Midwest, yeah, you should focus a lot on tornadoes. But if you've got that gas line, you need to focus on evacuation. It just can go on, figuratively speaking, that way. But you need to know what you don't know so that you can plan appropriately. And it comes as no surprise when the officer knocks on the door and says there's a gas line leaking down the street, and you say to yourselves, what gas line? Or, whatever scenario you can think of.
Yeah, that's a great piece about probability and severity, and yeah, doing a risk analysis. I like that.
That's essentially what it is. It's a risk analysis, and that's what CMS says in its regulations. Facilities are required to do a risk analysis. Their plan needs to be based on that risk analysis, and they also have to develop continuity of operation plans or business continuity plans to continue their service and their operations through a disaster. Because when it comes right down to it, in any healthcare facility, or maybe any occupancy for that matter, it comes down to, two questions. Should I stay or should I go? Are we going to shelter in place or are we going to evacuate?
Yeah, that's great. Well, Stan, I always like to kind of wrap up my interviews with, professional development questions. And I always like to ask from people who are really plugged in, um, what kind of resources or professional societies would you recommend to professionals that are interested about your area of expertise?
Well, certainly, being a member of the National Fire Protection Association is something that I would recommend, and I would assume that many folks with an interest in this field are already connected to. State fire marshal or fire inspector associations, fire chiefs associations, other professional organizations that are out there. Even though I'm retired 18 years now, I stay connected with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the Fire Marshals Associations, and different organizations and agencies that can provide me with educational updates and things that I can stay connected to the industry without just always focusing on, my own clients and what their needs are. I like to be aware of, one of the parts of my practice is that I do now a lot of active shooter training, armed intruder, active shooter. I work with many schools. I work with people who've experienced these shootings. So, as much experience as you can get to help you drive your passion. And I got to really focus on passion because, Gus, I get the impression not an impression, I know that you've got a passion for what you do. I hope it's clear that I have a passion for what I do. You've got to follow your passion with professional development. Don't get stuck in your own silo. It would be easy for me to just focus on healthcare. But as an example, I'm going to go to right here in Arizona next week, the Arizona Fire Chiefs Association conference, and sit in on a few sessions that they'll be presenting. So it's like you can never learn enough when it comes to this stuff, and when it comes to emergency preparedness. You always learn something new after every event, after reviewing every after action report, reading every critique, every article that's out there. It's a continuous process.
Awesome. Well, I think I can't think of any other better way to wrap things up, Stan. I just want to thank you so much for your time, and yeah, I really enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you.
Gus, it's been my pleasure, and I hope we get to talk again.
Sure, we will. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.